Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Jurisprudence podcast with me, Alex.
And me, Charlotte.
And this episode is going to be the first of, I think, 4 or 5 episodes specifically talking about the ICC and its relationship to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I said I wasn't going to do Israel-Palestine for every single episode,
but you've managed to do that so far.
Pretty much. But the reason why is because it's a very big topic within international law. And this episode is titled What's Going On with the ICC, because essentially what we're going to do is just provide something of a basic overview of the story so far when it comes to the arrest warrants, when it comes to the case that has been brought against various members of the Israeli government and members of Hamas, the charges themselves, and essentially this is going to just sort of spread out into a number of episodes over the next sort of 10 weeks, discussing issues relating to complementarity, discussing issues relating to the US reaction to these arrest warrants, as well as things related to the actual crimes themselves, some of the issues that arise out of the fact that we're talking about war crimes, the classification of the conflict itself, and all of these different things as well. So yeah.
Yeah, sounds good. And this is part of a sort of format shift that you suggested, that we cover a theme or a topic over the course of several episodes to kind of develop it, look deeper into different aspects, and you've chosen the ICC and sort of its functioning and everything.
Yeah, I think so. I think because one of the issues that I tend to always think about when looking at podcasts, specifically podcasts which discuss international law, is that they're very good in terms of the people that they have on and the insight and the expertise, but they don't quite go into enough detail because the episodes are normally an hour and a half max. But if you want to talk about all of the really detailed and intricate issues relating to the ICC and this Israel-Palestine case, you're going to need 3-4 hours to discuss all the various different aspects. So that's what I'm planning on doing over the next few weeks. There will be individual episodes. There will be sort of news episodes that we'll still do over time. But that's really what this is going to be for the next 5 weeks, or at least for the next 5 episodes that I do, at the very least. So we'll still take it in turns as well. So shall we just sort of start from the very beginning? The ICC is the International Criminal Court. It is responsible for the prosecution of 4 specific crimes within international criminal law.
Under the Rome Statute.
Yes, under the Rome Statute. These crimes are genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. And in May, on the 20th of May of this year, we see the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, announce that he has submitted an application for the warrants for the arrest of a number of individuals who are involved in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Now, this is a major addition to international criminal justice. It's not the first time that a head of state has been prosecuted. Famously, Milosevic was prosecuted. Yeah. Famously, arrest warrants have gone out for Vladimir Putin as well, and other individuals around the world. But it seems to be the case that it is the first time that a head of state that is aligned and associated with the West and Western hegemony has been prosecuted, or has an arrest warrant potentially being issued out by the pretrial chamber, which is very interesting.
Yeah. Typically, the way that the ICC functions is that it brings prosecutions against individuals not necessarily attached to the state, but like individual actors within a conflict.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can see quite a lot of the prosecutions aren't people like a president or that kind of thing. It's
not often. Although there are very key examples. There was prime ministers in Rwanda and like I said, Milosevic when it came to Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, it's hard to get the head of state of an individual, or of a country, a president or a prime minister, on charges of violations of international criminal law, despite us all probably conclusively arguing that there should be a charge and a trial for violations of international criminal law. It's difficult to get them, and we'll get to that later on in this episode. But specifically, let's just ask a couple of questions, okay? So the first is, who are the arrests going out to, essentially? Who are being charged or alleged to have committed international violations of international criminal law? Well, it's 5 individuals in total. However, 2 of the 5 individuals are already dead as a result of Israeli action in Beirut and in Tehran. So I won't get to the sort of bottom 2 individuals there. But the 3 people who are still alive, as far as we know, one of them it might be a bit sketchy, but the 3 people we definitely know are still alive are Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Again, Sinwar, occasionally we find evidence that he is still alive, but it's also very much the case that the IDF and Israeli forces want to kill Sinwar, as you would probably imagine. So that's who the arrest warrant's request has gone out for, and I will keep on making it clear that we're talking about requests, and I'll get to that later on as well.
Important qualification.
Yeah, the prosecutor has to make a request for an arrest warrant, and that is made to the pretrial chamber, and it's up to the pretrial chamber to determine whether or not to allow the issuance of arrest warrants.
It might be worth just mentioning the actual structure of the ICC. The difference between the pretrial chamber and the prosecutor.
Well, the pretrial chamber is obviously the judicial organ, and in the sense that is delineated from the prosecutor in the same way that a common law system has a delineation between a judge and the prosecutor, the people who go about prosecuting these individual crimes. So, essentially, if you're talking about a domestic system, if you're in the US, you get a grand jury indictment, for example, in certain circumstances. Look at the Trump trials, for example. In the UK, you'll get indictments again that don't necessarily always come from a prosecutor, and so it shows a clear separation of powers, if you will, between the various different parts of the criminal justice system. It's not the prosecutor that can just go about willy-nilly getting arrest warrants. They have to request arrest warrants on the basis of a standard of evidence, which again we will also get to. Anything you want to add?
No, that was good.
Okay. In terms of the crimes that are being sought, there are a few crimes that are being sought out. So, for Netanyahu and Gallant, the people who are in charge of the Israeli military and part of the Israeli government infrastructure, they are being accused of the war crime of, quote, intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. This is under Article 8b XXV of the ICC statute. So Article 8 concerns itself with war crimes, and you've got a number of war crimes that are listed in that substantive crime. Also included for the Israeli leaders are the war crimes of willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and the intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population. This is under paragraph 22 of the indictment, or of the request, should I say.
So this goes to the idea that the Israeli military are targeting civilians specifically in the Gaza Strip when conducting their military operations,
or at the very least are indiscriminate in their attacks. So obviously evidence of directly and intentionally targeting civilians because they're civilians is a lot more difficult to ascertain than evidence of indiscriminate attacks. So the sort of like the sort of lower standard, the threshold of evidence in that regard. When it comes to Hamas leaders, the allegations include actions which were perpetrated on October the 7th, the attack on over 1,000 Israeli individuals, a number of them being civilians, including hostage taking and basically kicking off this new conflict, this new round of armed conflict between members of the Gaza Strip and Israel. So these include war crimes of taking at least 245 persons hostage, that's automatically a war crime. Taking any hostage is a violation of international humanitarian law. The crime against humanity of murder or extermination for the killing of hundreds of civilians, as well as the war crimes of rape and other forms of sexual violence, torture, cruel treatment, and outrages upon personal dignity. That is found in paragraph 16. So there is evidence of sexual violence both on October the 7th, as per the UN report, and there's also evidence of sexual violence perpetrated against hostages as since October the 7th as well. So one of the things that should be noted here is that there isn't, as some people seem to either believe or seem to sort of implicitly suggest, a hierarchy of crimes in international criminal law.
Unfortunately, I feel like that is always going to be the case, regardless of how much you sort of drill into people, that these are meant to be equally prosecuted.
Or equally serious.
It might stem from the perception of domestic crimes, where you have a quite obvious hierarchy of crimes.
Yeah. There's hierarchy a lot in domestic criminal law as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
But yeah, when it comes to international criminal law, the 4 crimes. If we just take aggression out of the equation for a second, we just talk about genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. They are all equally as severe because there is no hierarchy there. Crimes against humanity can be just as severe. It could be worse in terms of our sort of moral conceptions of immoral actions. It could be worse than genocide because, as we know, genocide can require only the mere killing of 1 or 2 people.
Yeah.
But the difference is that it has to be done with intent. So a war crime could be worse than an act of genocide, depending on certain circumstances. The difference between the 3 major crimes isn't necessarily entirely the acts, because for example, killing an individual is something that is an act that would could form part of a prosecution of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes.
Yeah.
The difference is the context, the mens rea, and other aspects that distinguish these crimes. So for genocide, that particular killing has to be done with genocidal intent. For crimes against humanity, that particular killing would have to be done as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. For a war crime, that type of killing has to be done as part of a violation of international humanitarian law during an armed conflict.
Yeah.
So those are the things that distinguish the different crimes from each other, not the severity of the crimes.
And a person might do the same thing, and you could attach any one of the crimes to it. It just depends on what the prosecutor deems to be most appropriate, either for the standard of evidence that they have, the types of evidence that they have. Specifically for genocide, proving the special intent is particularly difficult, and therefore it might be more appropriate to prosecute under crimes against humanity, for example, because the ingredients of the offense are much more likely to be satisfied. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's being treated as less severe.
Nope,
or
absolutely not.
That the severity of the acts themselves are being undermined because it's just simply a different way of putting the evidence together, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And this is a point that we will make as time goes on, that it's very, very likely that these are not the only charges and the only requests for arrest for charging of crimes that we're going to get. There's a lot more things that we can think about and talk about, and potentially genocide might come as a charge. The prosecutor makes it very clear, and I think that is very clear when it comes to ICL prosecutions, is that they are going to prosecute the crime for the crimes that they think they're going to be able to get.
Yeah.
So there has been a little bit of a backlash on in regard to why not genocide? Why has not genocide been charged? In regard to either of the sides, in regard to either the Israeli side or even the Hamas side in relation to October the 7th.
Right.
But the problem is it's a very difficult crime to prove, and so they are proving other crimes instead.
Yeah.
And as time goes on, we might see those crimes arise in the future. But that's just the point that I want to make, that in terms of the distinction, that the war crime of intentionally using starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, in terms of the kind of damage and destruction that can do to a population, might be far worse than the war crime or the crime against humanity of the killing of hundreds of civilians. And so we shouldn't look at these as sort of one is more severe and one is less severe. They're all very severe.
Yeah.
They're all almost equally severe as well. Contrary to popular belief, these are warrant requests, as I've already noted. They are not actual warrants. They are requests to the pretrial chamber. We'll get to that again, like I said, later on. But these are requests that haven't come out of nowhere. Okay, so they're not warrants that have appeared out of a response to the October 7th attack, for example. And I think what I'm going to just do is do a little bit of myth busting,
right,
and a little bit of clearing up some factual basis and factual circumstances in relation to these arrest warrants, and in relation to the relationship between the ICC and this conflict more generally.
Yeah, that leads us in nicely, because I think a lot of the perception around this like resurgence of conflict is that nothing was happening before.
No.
And now that it's come to light into public attention, arguably more so than in the past, people have developed quite a few misconceptions regarding the tensions that have already been there, and so on. So
yeah, and whereas some people like to use the phrase, history didn't begin on October the 7th as a sort of justification for that violence that took place on that on that day, people tend to say, well, you're saying this is a violent act, but history didn't begin on that day. They are technically right. They are correct.
Yeah,
that there has been violence, but there's also sort of the missing of the point that even though there has been violence, and even though there has been conflict, and there has arguably potentially been occupation and all these different kinds of things, and a sort of state of injustice is taking place in relation to the Palestinian people, we shouldn't overlook the fact that October the 7th was a very major event. It was the single worst day of violence against the Jewish population since the Holocaust. So let's not overlook that, while also recognizing that history didn't begin on October the 7th, as this ICC investigation shows. Do you want to add something?
No.
Okay. So yeah, the first myth is that this was an investigation that was opened in response to the October 7th attack. This is false, as I've just mentioned. There was a request for the opening of an investigation into the Israeli-Palestinian situation as early as 2019. So in December 2019, the previous ICC prosecutor requested the initiation of an investigation, which was part of her purview under Article 53 of the Rome Statute. Now, there is an episode that we're going to do in relation to Palestinian statehood and in relation to the ICC's position regarding Palestinian statehood, because this is one of the things that has potentially meant that the pretrial chamber has been unable to, or at least has delayed or has extended the amount of time it's going to take for the issuance of these arrest warrants. Because essentially, challenges have been instigated regarding jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that the ICC has in terms of jurisdiction is not only jurisdiction over territory that is a party to the ICC. So, for example, if a war crime was committed in the United Kingdom, the ICC could have jurisdiction, avoiding complementarity and all those different kinds of issues. But
because we've ratified the Rome Statute.
Because we're a part of the Rome Statute,
yeah.
Exactly. But we also should note that if a different country that is not a part of the Rome Statute, let's say the US invades Great Britain and commits war crimes, the ICC would have jurisdiction over those US soldiers in that regard because they were committed in the territory in which there is a member state to the Rome Statute.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why, when it comes to Afghanistan, there was an Afghanistan investigation in relation to US soldiers potentially committing war crimes in Afghanistan.
Right.
Afghanistan is a member of the ICC, it's a member of the Rome Statute. The United States is not, but the US soldiers, US nationals, allegedly committed war crimes on that territory.
Yeah.
And so they have jurisdiction over those people because it was done in that territory. And so if we apply that same principle to this conflict, Palestine, for all intents and purposes, is a party to the Rome Statute. There's a little bit of a funny situation that we have to think about in relation to statehood in that regard. But if, as the pre-trial chamber has determined, that they do have jurisdiction over Palestinian territory, that means that they will have jurisdiction over Israeli actions in Palestinian territory.
Right.
Hence why the issuance of arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. So the initial investigation came as the result of a number of requests on determinations about jurisdiction and the applicability of Palestinian representation in the court. Now, some people argue that the fact that the pre-trial chamber had made that determination, that they do have jurisdiction, that they are therefore making a claim about Palestinian statehood. But the pre-trial chamber make it very clear that they don't have the authority to do that. They don't have the authority to say, we believe that Palestine is a state.
Yeah.
They were just saying, and we'll get to it in a future lesson because there's a very interesting paper on it. They were just saying, we, for the purposes of jurisdiction, are going to have jurisdiction over Palestine.
Just for the sake of this specific instance, not necessarily speaking to the broader legal implications of what they're doing.
What do you mean?
As in, like you just said, they're not determining that they have statehood or not. They're just saying for the purposes of these arrest warrants.
Yeah, for what we're concerned in, which is ICL and the Rome Statute, we think that there is jurisdiction. Again, there are challenges to this. That's what the amicus briefs sort of process has been all about, talking about the extent to which the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has the authority to enter into and to have these kinds of international relations under the Oslo Accords, which again is a future episode, don't worry. We'll get to that in a future episode. But that's the first myth, okay? This has been going on since at least 2019 in relation to a variety of different events. The second myth is that this is an investigation over Israeli-Palestinian conflict in relation to only the Gaza Strip. This is also false. In February 2021, Pre-Trial Chamber 1 concluded that the court's territorial jurisdiction applies not only to the Gaza Strip, but it also applies to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Now, as we have already noted in an earlier episode, as part of our coverage of the ICJ advisory opinion on the legality of Israeli actions in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, West Bank and East Jerusalem, and potentially the Gaza Strip, their actions are unlawful.
Yes,
I think Professor Milanovic made a point in an earlier podcast episode on Egypt that the idea that Israel is violating international law in their occupation of the West Bank is obvious. It is so clearly obvious, and the court concluding that is not really that uncontroversial.
No.
And so one of the things that is taking place and has been taking place since the 1990s, at least the 1990s, is under their occupation of the West Bank, they have expanded settlements. They have moved Israeli populations into Palestinian areas or Palestinian occupied territory, which is just automatically a war crime. That's a violation of international humanitarian law. So I expect, and I in fact hope, that the ICC, if they are going to continue this investigation, will continue and will issue further charges for violations of IHL in relation to those settlements, because those settlements are also illegal, they're also immoral, and they make the situation of the two-state solution very difficult, so much more difficult to conclude. Because this was a problem that we saw in the 2000s, where we got the closest we ever have gotten to a two-state solution, where instead of just saying, you can have the West Bank, we will remove our occupation, we'll withdraw forces, the Gaza Strip will withdraw forces, we'll come to an agreement on East Jerusalem. They now have to either think about moving 500,000 people out of these territories or doing land swaps. Where it's like, well, okay, well, you have 96% of the West Bank and then take 4% of Israeli territory as a sort of way of balancing out the land that we've taken over the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
Not helpful. It's not useful. It doesn't work. Okay, and it's unlawful under international law. So that's what we see in terms of not just the Gaza Strip, not just the current conflict, but this is a much broader conversation about the entirety of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay. The next myth is that these are arrest warrants. Okay, again, we already know that this is not an arrest warrant. These are a procedure which requires essentially the prosecutor to present a case for the issuance of arrests to the pretrial chamber. Like I said, the pretrial chamber, under their authority under Article 58.1 of the Rome Statute, will then have to assess whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that the persons in question have committed the crime within the jurisdiction.
This is sort of like when the police build a case against someone, or they present the evidence they might have, and it is up to the Crown Prosecution Service to decide whether this is something that can go ahead as a trial.
Yeah, exactly. And when it comes to in any kind of domestic or international criminal system, the prosecutor to the ICC is going to try and make sure as much as possible that they have the evidence, and they have enough evidence such that the issuance of an arrest warrant is basically guaranteed.
The timing of this is actually quite important as well, because if they rush things ahead, then it might be that they sort of lose out on further evidence, because if they say, okay, go ahead and arrest these people, then it sort of falls away if you don't allow time for evidence to build up and to go through the motions in terms of building a proper case.
Yeah, and that might be the reason why we see war crimes and crimes against humanity charges, but we don't see genocide charges.
Right.
Because genocide's a much harder thing to prove, and so you're going to need a lot more evidence, especially when it comes to a conflict that's taken place over an entire year. Mm-hmm. And if we go back even further to sort of 2019, there's a lot of contextual factors that are at play here, that it's easier to build up a case for what is clearly a violation of international law, what seemingly is clearly a violation of international law, and so you can sort of guarantee that we get an arrest warrant. Mm-hmm. Which is what this is a reason why people that when there are unsealed indictments in international law, or when there are unsealed indictments in a domestic system in the US, for example. I think there's an interesting statistic that sort of State Department indictments in the US have something like a 98% prosecution rate. And the reason for that is because they don't unseal an indictment, or they don't issue an indictment for an arrest until they know exactly what they know. They're very confident that they're going to get an arrest. That's what the CPS does as well. The CPS isn't going to charge if there isn't a realistic prospect of prosecution, of winning. So that's what's taking place now in relation to the pretrial chamber. The pretrial chamber, for whatever reason, was not necessarily satisfied with the question of whether or not they have jurisdiction over this case. And so what they did was they have issued a number or request amicus briefs in relation to that question. An amicus brief, for those who are that legally savvy, shall I say, are simply written documents that essentially try and support the court in answering a particular question.
Right.
Often from people who are not involved in the case. So a number of people, a number of states, a number of professors of international law, people, NGOs and advocacy groups have have essentially presented evidence, presented arguments, presented information to the pre-trial chamber about whether or not they believe they have jurisdiction.
Sort of unpicking existing law, jurisprudence from previous cases, etc., to understand.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that came about as a result of these arrest warrants and as a result of the opening of an investigation into this conflict in general was whether or not the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, acting to try and get ICC jurisdiction, had the ability to engage within international relations under the basic provisions of the Oslo Accords, which took place in the 1990s. And so a number of pro-Israeli advocacy groups, pro-Israeli legal scholars have essentially tried to present that argument, to push that argument to say, well, actually, you don't actually have jurisdiction over Israeli nationals in this case. And then a number of professors and other legal scholars who are on the other side of the debate or who are looking at it from a different light have presented arguments to suggest that there is. I think generally, from reading, I've not read every single amicus. There's been about, I think, like 30 different amicus briefs that have been issued to the pre-trial chamber. From reading the ones that I have read, it seems quite convincing to me that they do indeed have jurisdiction. So essentially, the court just wants to make sure, if we're being charitable to the court, they just want to make sure they had jurisdiction, and they didn't want to issue an arrest warrant unlawfully, essentially.
Which basically covers your next point, that they've taken too long.
Yeah, I don't understand this claim. I've seen a lot of professors, I've seen a lot of legal scholars, very, very prestigious people talking about these arrest warrants, the issuance of these arrest warrants, and that they have taken way too long. The request was in May, and it's been we've heard nothing yet. We've not heard anything. We're now in October. That this is somehow taking a very, very long time.
Well, it's been like 5 months.
Well, 5 months, but that sounds like a long time, and I guess it's very, very pressing given that we're involved in a conflict that is currently ongoing. But I don't think that this is unusual necessarily compared to the issuance of arrest warrants. So, for example, the head of state, Omar al-Bashir, it took 9 months from request to arrest warrant, in terms of that particular case. So it took 9 months for that. It sometimes takes a lot shorter. So when it came to Vladimir Putin, the head of state of the Russian Federation, that took only 1 month.
So what were the kind of legal questions which led for that case to take 9 months versus Vladimir Putin's?
I'm not sure. I'm not too sure. I'd have to look into it in a lot more detail.
Because the sort of intricacies regarding jurisdiction and the very sort of teetering relationship that is currently taking place, I don't know if this is unique to this conflict and therefore expecting a little more time. But by comparison, this has taken 5 months and it's sort of building up. And do you reckon that it would come out soon, or?
I would assume so. It's difficult to pass this conflict in a way that doesn't sound biased or doesn't sound. It's very. I don't know how else I would describe it, because some people have argued that, for whatever reason, the pre-trial chamber had requested amicus briefs, and that's perfectly within their authority and within their jurisdiction to do so. But that some of the arguments that were presented, some of the more pro-Israeli arguments that were presented, represented something of like a type of lawfare, using law as a method of warfare, basically. And so sort of bogging down and overcomplicating and making it a very convoluted situation in order to sort of slow things down.
Dragging your feet.
There's also the US influence over the ICC when it comes to the issuance of arrest warrants. Famously, the US has sanctioned ICC members, has threatened ICC employees and representatives for potentially going after allies or going after their own nationals in various circumstances.
Well, this sort of goes back to the history of the US and the construction of the ICC in the first place.
Yeah.
Because when the Rome Statute was being sort of deliberated over, the US sort of held their hands up and said, we want no part of this, and they didn't.
Well, it's interesting. The US actually were very, very much involved in the creation of the Rome Statute.
Exactly, yeah.
But then when it came to putting pen to paper and actually committing yourself to the Rome Statute, they decided not to. Something of a change. There's a change of presidential administration. You went from a Democrat to a Republican. Republicans have been historically more isolationist, more hostile to the world, the international order. Clinton was quite on board when it came to the ICC, and then Bush wasn't. Obama was sort of...
Interestingly.
Yeah, interestingly, exactly. Obama was more friendly to the ICC while still not joining the ICC, so I believe that Obama was... There were a number of arrest warrants and a number of people that were brought to the ICC with the help of the United States.
Yeah, well, we were still in Afghanistan at the time.
Yeah. Trump was very hostile to the ICC, will be hostile to the ICC if he gets re-elected. Biden has sort of, again, sort of, interestingly for Biden, it is the case that this is the first time that the ICC has sought the arrest warrants for an ally, for Netanyahu. So a lot of the United States' reaction to it from both the Republican and the Democratic side has been very, very interesting. And it'd be very interesting to see if Kamala Harris was to get elected in November, what she would do in relation to the ICC and the arrest warrants, or what Trump would do. It's very much up in the air. The sort of traditional sort of Democratic and Republican responses to foreign policy has changed completely.
It seems to me, I would characterize the Democratic response to foreign policy as passive-aggressive indifference. It's sort of like being a bit boorish and unhelpful, but also seemingly like putting on a face of trying to be helpful.
Yeah, the Democrats have historically, at least since the ICC has existed, been a lot more friendly with the ICC and sort of international law more generally. And you sort of think that they are, if you're gonna get the US to join the ICC, for example, or to join other treaties and organizations and involve themselves and follow international law,
it'd be under a Democrat.
It would be under a Democrat, but historically they sort of are more friendly without actually taking that step. They still sort of argue for the existence of US exceptionalism in regard to this stuff, that we will deal with our things ourselves and we'll just support you dealing with international law on your own.
Well, I imagine that post-Trump presidency that has become a lot more difficult because he's riled up the isolationist voter base such that any Democrat will struggle to have the backing of those people in terms of being more open to global policy such as this.
Well, that's why we need as liberal thinking people from all over the world. That's why we need to see a full house in November for this election. We need to see Kamala Harris winning the executive branch, winning the presidency, as well as the Democrats winning both houses of Congress.
Well, I imagine that even in that case, we would have to see a good 5 years of that kind of executive and
potentially. I don't think
legislative power.
I don't think the US are ever joining the ICC. Bearing that in mind,
you basically have to wait for the electorate to change their minds and have a left wing sea change, which is going to take a good long time post Trump because he's basically
insane,
messed with everyone.
I don't even think. Let's say that Bernie won the nomination in 2020.
Yeah.
Or and then won the presidency instead of Biden. I don't even think Bernie Sanders. I'm not sure what Bernie Sanders' position is on the ICC, but I'm not even sure that even if he got into office.
Well, he wouldn't have been able to.
Well, he would if he had a Congress.
Well, yeah, but yeah, good point.
The signing and ratification of treaties is under the purview of the legislature with the support of the executive, I believe.
Yeah.
Under the Constitution. Anyway, yeah, the US.
Nice tangent.
Yeah, we'll talk about the US in the ICC in a separate episode.
Interestingly, leading up to the US election.
Yeah, exactly. That'll be
So
great. Maybe I'll do that. I'll do that next.
a special episode.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the question of why they have taken so long, it seems quite obvious to me. There's this sort of amicus submissions, the fact that it takes a few months anyway, ranging it from the sort of quite extensive period of time of 9 months to the rather short time of 1 month, being sort of 5 or 6 months into a conflict or into the request. It doesn't seem too out of the ordinary. Um, Obviously, it could be shorter, and it would be nice if it was shorter.
Yeah.
But this leads to the final sort of or the penultimate myth or the penultimate question is that will these arrest warrants actually mean anything? Now there are sort of two answers to this question. There's the answer to the question to this question that comes from the sort of cynical international lawyer who has seen international law be eroded by everybody on all sides of this Middle Eastern conflict over the last year, which is no, that it won't do anything, nothing's going to happen. And given that 2 of the 3 arrest warrants for Hamas leaders, the people are dead already as the result of Israeli assassination attempts, given that the Israeli leaders have allied capacity of the United States, it's highly unlikely that we will ever see Netanyahu, Gallant, and Sinwar on trial in the ICC in the Hague in the same way that we saw Milosevic at the ICTY and all the various different people in that conflict.
I would tend to lean into this answer because of the sheer problem of enforcing the arrest warrants once they're allowed.
Yeah, exactly. Once they're issued.
Yeah.
Another good example of this is the recent visit of Vladimir Putin to Mongolia. Mongolia is a member of the ICC, and as a party to the Rome Statute, they had an international legal obligation to, as soon as Putin touched down on Mongolian territory, to arrest and to extradite Putin to The Hague.
Yeah.
That is part of the sort of state's authority in these different circumstances. So now, if these arrest warrants were issued, would Netanyahu be able to go to the United Kingdom? We would be under an obligation in the UK to send him to The Hague or to arrest him, but would we do so?
Probably not.
You would think probably not, wouldn't you? Definitely. Again, this also depends on the political relationship. If we've got a conservative government, then almost definitely not. Maybe with a Labour government, maybe there would be the potential of that, but I still will doubt it very much as well.
I mean, I've seen headlines in the news. I don't know how much salt I should take with them, but Starmer being quite favorable towards Israel and
well,
but I don't know how much that would speak to his willingness to forego international legal obligations.
Well, I would say that I think Starmer and the Labour government has treaded quite a difficult line when it comes to Israeli relations. They are obviously an ally. They obviously respect that trust and relationship with Israel in the Middle East and the sort of soft power implications that come with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that Starmer has called since, I believe, the beginning of 2024 for a ceasefire and for negotiations.
Of course.
As soon as David Lammy got into office in July, he requested new legal advice on whether or not Israel has violated IHL, and so as a result of that advice, has suspended a number of arms contracts and arms sales to Israel,
which came out recently,
which was a couple of weeks ago as well. The sort of Starmer government has been more open to just unilaterally recognizing Palestine as a state in relation to this conflict. So I think they're doing better than most people thought. Obviously, it depends on what position and how much knowledge you have on the topic will depend on your response to whether or not Starmer has done good or bad in relation to relation to Israel-Palestine. I think they've definitely done better than what we had before.
Oh yeah, of course. I feel like all of these policies are very positive in terms of kind of helping assist resolve things. I don't know if resolution is ever in our future sight, but hopefully.
In relation to like the go on.
I was gonna say that these seem to be very much like invisible hand maneuvers for going against kind of Israeli conduct.
Potentially, yeah.
Whether if Netanyahu lands in the UK tomorrow and the arrest warrants go out and we're under an obligation, whether Starmer would actually do the thing and send the police to go and arrest him. I don't know if that would be.
I doubt that will happen. I doubt that will happen. Which is quite sad. It's quite cynical, but it's also, international politics. It's not law. It's politics at that point.
Well, that just goes to show that, unfortunately, a lot of geopolitics is involved in international law, even though it shouldn't be.
Yeah, technically. So that's the cynical answer. The cynical answer is that it will do nothing. But I think it depends on what you expect from these arrest warrants. So if you think that there should be an arrest warrant and then that these arrest warrants should then be enforced automatically, we see them all at the Hague, as well as Putin as well on their own trial, and we see the prosecutor putting the justice to them, and we see a potential recourse and a punishment for these alleged crimes. If you think that that's what the standard should be, I agree. But if you think that's what the standard is going to be, then you'll be very disappointed. However, you can see that if these arrest warrants are issued, what this does is dramatically shrink the world that Netanyahu and Gallant can live in. And if we look at a quote by Dannenbaum, he says that warrants would change how the identified individuals can engage with the world, provide a focal point for various forms of political and legal mobilization, including in the US against supplying military aid to Israel, and impact the standing of the ICC for different audiences. So I think this answer is a lot more nuanced, and I think it's a little bit more positive, because when it comes to the issuance of these arrest warrants, like it says here, it would mean that Netanyahu and Gallant have to think twice, quite carefully about where they go and which foreign ally they visit. But in addition to that, it also provides for greater legal mobilization for states that are providing aid to Israel. So one of the things that has been taking place consistently is whether or not arming Israel is contributing to violations of international law. And if that is the case, these arrest warrants provide more meat to the bones of the sort of legal argumentation for why there should be the suspension of aid to Israel, or at least of offensive military equipment to Israel. And so really this is a bit more of a nuanced response to that question.
And the kind of political difficulties that we just mentioned, a lot more tension is placed, therefore, on those relationships, such that the sort of foregoing of legal obligations under international law creates tensions with other relationships, not just with Israel or Palestine.
Yeah, and it speaks to the sort of the power of formalization, because at the moment there isn't an arrest warrant, there isn't anything like that, and
it's just sort of vibes based.
What
people decide to do.
We're all pretty sure that Netanyahu and Gallant have violated IHL in relation to Gaza. You know for a fact that the Israeli government has violated IHL in relation to the settlements in the West Bank, but the formalization of that, a formal charge by an international institution like the ICC that is concerned with international justice, a formal charge of that nature speaks to a lot of power.
Yeah.
No longer are they just allegedly war criminals in terms of, well, no longer are they, people are calling them war criminals. They are actually officially, allegedly war criminals under international criminal law. That speaks to a significant amount of power that the ICC has in terms of its authority. It has the ability to make that charge in a formalistic sense, in the same sense that the ICJ does the same when it comes to violating the Genocide Convention. At the moment, people are just alleging that there is a genocide taking place, and people are presenting whatever arguments that they do. But when the ICJ says that, if the ICJ concludes that is the case, it's a formalization of that charge. And it becomes a lot more difficult for third states and for allies to ignore. You can ignore activists and you can ignore other politicians, you can ignore lawyers, and you can ignore professors.
Because it all contributes to the kind
Yeah,
of air.
they're presenting arguments for that proposition,
Yeah.
whereas courts and institutions
create legal grounding for those arguments.
provide more legal grounding for those arguments,
Yeah.
and provide legal formalization of those arguments as well. So, go on.
Well, I was just gonna say, in true me fashion, it's the difference between a suspect and a defendant.
Exactly.
Because it sort of puts the gears in action in terms of all the different organs of prosecution.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with the request for the arrests already by the prosecutor, we can sort of talk as if we are talking about actual defendants and actual allegations. But until those requests are issued, which I'm almost 99% sure that they will be, we're sort of in a bit of a legal limbo, or at least from a very formalistic perspective, we're in a legal limbo about, well, they're not actually defendants quite yet, if you know what I mean. They're not actually being accused they're not been charged yet, so therefore they're still suspects, as you would say.
Yeah.
So it would be very nice if we got these arrest warrants as quickly as possible. Now, I just want to finish by thinking about the idea of complementarity very, very briefly, because I want to do an episode on complementarity itself. And this is one of the things that is fascinating about the international system, because the purpose of the Rome Statute and the purpose of the ICC is not to supplant the jurisdictions of domestic legal systems. It is to complement them. And essentially, in order to complement them, it is therefore situations of a sufficient gravity that the domestic system is unwilling or unable to prosecute. So if you've got a war situation, let's say half of the judiciary has been killed in this horrific conflict, and it's all of the institutions and infrastructures have fallen down, it would be that state would be unable to prosecute alleged war crimes or crimes against humanity in that territory. And in those circumstances, the ICC should step in and provide for that kind of infrastructure to do those prosecutions. Or if there is allegations of war crimes, but the state is not willing to prosecute them, let's say, well, they're our nationals, we're not willing to prosecute these people.
Or indeed, they are state individuals themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Netanyahu.
Yeah, Netanyahu. Then the ICC steps in. So that's what complementarity means. But it also means that there is technically a get-out clause for Netanyahu and Gallant, or at least for Israel as a sort of state in the world, in order to sort of render these charges inadmissible. They could just investigate Netanyahu and Gallant, because obviously there is a separation of powers in Israel. There is a judiciary and there is an executive branch and there is a legislature and all these different kinds of things. And they would, if an investigation was brought in relation to Netanyahu and Gallant, and it was shown that it was covering substantially the same conduct and was a genuine investigation, not just a sham investigation, then that could render these charges against these Israeli leaders inadmissible.
That would be quite difficult, though, because I think if that took place, the global outrage at Israel essentially investigating into themselves and coming out with the fact that the charges were inadmissible, I think would...
Well, it would render the charges it would render the jurisdiction of the ICC inadmissible.
Yeah.
It would mean that the ICC couldn't touch it.
Yeah.
If there was a genuine investigation going. But that should be the point. Yeah. People shouldn't feel like, well, it's just the country investigating itself. It should feel like it's people, it's a judicial system investigating alleged criminals in the same way that a judicial system in the UK would investigate a murderer in the UK for murder crimes or whatever.
Well, yeah, and we'll get to this in the other episode, that that's the point of complementarity, is that obviously the ICC doesn't have its own enforcement organ, so it relies on domestic courts broadly to prosecute crimes. Very few international crimes actually see The Hague. because they're tried in domestic courts,
Yeah,
right?
and I think that should be the case, and I think that that's the thing that countries like the US and like the UK we should be proud of. We should be proud of the fact that we, when it comes to war crimes and when it comes to international humanitarian law, we have a track record, maybe not a perfect track record, but we have at least a track record of prosecuting our nationals. We have court martials in the UK and in the US. There is the court martial process. There's the famous Alexander Blackman case, the Marine A who murdered the Taliban insurgent in violation of IHL. So we have those kinds of things. That individual didn't go to the ICC because we had dealt with it as the United Kingdom's judicial system ourselves. So
it's sort of two sides of the same coin, because there's a political benefit of doing that and taking responsibility for the actions of your own nationals. But at the same time, what I was trying to get at was I feel that there's such a global fallout in response to Israel's action that I don't think it would be seen in the same positive light if they did that.
No, it wouldn't. People want to see them in The Hague. However, if they did do that, if there was a genuine investigation from the judiciary in Israel, from a prosecutor, from the Attorney General or whatever in Israel, into the head of state and the Minister of Defense, that is a significant action.
Because it should be viewed in a positive light.
I think so, because if the ICC is gonna ignore the sort of the political implications of the US sanctioning them or whatever, they should also ignore the political implications, the political fallout that would come from letting the Israeli state do its own investigation.
Yeah.
But the point is that is not seen to be happening and is unlikely to happen. There's no way that that's going to happen. There's a reason why the ICC isn't issuing arrests for Israeli IDF soldiers alleging war crimes, because the IDF does actually have also a history of prosecuting and convicting their war criminals. And there's also the question of the sufficient gravity of a case. But there is not a history of them investigating their own heads of state.
No.
And there's not really a history of anyone investigating their own heads of state for violations of international criminal law.
So this would set an incredible precedent, actually, if they did do that. But
it's never going to happen.
It's never going
to happen. So that really ties up all of the sort of myth busting that I want to get to when it comes to these arrest warrants. The episodes that I've sort of planned are relating to complementarity, as I've just mentioned, so talking about how complementarity works in a lot more detail beyond just the Rome Statute, but thinking about how the courts have interpreted complementarity. Looking at the US reaction, I think that'll probably be the next episode. It's we've got the election coming up very, very soon. Looking at the question of statehood and the ICC and the relationship between Palestine as a state and things like the Oslo Accord and the amicus briefs there. And then finally thinking about the charges themselves. The crimes that are charged, the jurisdiction of the crimes that are charged, as well as things relating to what type of armed conflict this is, which might have an impact. Spoiler alert, it does have an impact on the crimes that are charged, whether it's an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict, whether or not we can talk about occupation in that regard, all of these different kinds of things. Settlement expansion as well, and the war crime of expanding populations in occupied territories. All of these things are going to be discussed, and it's going to be about four episodes worth of stuff looking at the ICC in this particular conflict. So that's it. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll see everybody in 2 weeks' time when you do your episode, whatever that may be. I'm not sure what that is yet.
It's a surprise.
It's a surprise. Okay, very nice. And so keep in tune and keep a look at the news in case there is an arrest warrant that is issued. Hopefully, by the time we have done these 4 episodes, there will have been arrest warrants issued. That's my prediction.
Okay.
That at some point within the next few couple of months, when I go about doing each of these episodes, there will be arrest warrants issued.
And then we can talk about it.
And then we can even talk about them as well. Yeah. So, that's everything. Bye for now.